This Clan Buchanan program is a journey of discovery sweeping through the ages, to meet with ghosts of times past, to hear their stories, to explore the ancient castles, the homes of your ancestors, and discover the roots and richness of your Scottish heritage and name. And there is no better place to start our journey than here in Glasgow, Scotland's great industrial city in the foothills of the Highlands. Today, people come from all over the world to visit this historic city. But 200 years ago, these bustling streets were thronged with people here for a very different reason. Some following hardship in the Highlands, others seeking opportunity and adventure, came here to the port of Greenock in the Firth of Clyde, where they took ship for the Americas, and later for the younger countries of Australia and New Zealand, an emigration which continued almost to the middle of this century. But wherever they went in the world, these millions of Scots took with them the heritage, the sense of history, the traditions of this, their homeland. From scenes like these, old Scotia's grandeur springs. It makes her loved abroad, revered at home. From the towering snow-capped highlands in the north, through the purple-heathered glens of swirling mist, and onto the softly rolling hills of the borders, this ancient and beautiful land of Scotland is held dear in the hearts of millions of Scots worldwide. The story of Scotland and of her peoples is as complex and diverse as the many different cultures and traditions which have merged to form this most unique of countries. Cultures which have clashed through time, Highland and Lowland, Jacobite and Hanoverian, and yet have given birth to the stirring romanticism of the Gaelic lordship of the Isles, and to the remarkable achievements of the royal house of Stewart. Our story begins over 6,000 years ago, with the arrival of the first settlers in Scotland. These early pioneers discovered a deeply forested land, brooding and impenetrable. They settled along the coast and on the riverbanks. They lived by fishing and hunting in the dark woodlands. Enigmatic remains of these peoples can still be found. But their lives and thoughts are lost to us now, kept secret in this land once called Alba, now called Scotland. The Roman legions marched into Scotland about 80 AD, and it is from their historians we have the first records of this land and of her peoples. To the northeast, the oldest inhabitants known as the Picti, or the Painted people, whose origin is unknown to us. In the western Highlands, the Gaelic-speaking Celts, or Scoti, who had sailed from Ireland. Across the lowland areas were the Brythonic Celts. Their legends were those of King Arthur, and theirs was the magical land of Camelot. The Romans, who had conquered the known world, never managed to quell the indomitable spirit of Scotland. They ruled Britain for almost 4 centuries, but built the famous Hadrian's Wall to keep the warlike Scots at bay. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Anglo and the Saxon came to the lowlands. In time, Viking raiders came too, and with fire and sword conquered the north, east, and much of the Western Isles. For hundreds of years, Viking, Saxon, Celt, and Pict clashed in their battle for supremacy. The skill and courage of these warriors is reflected in the game of shinty, still played in the Highlands today. By the 11th century, the Gaelic Highlands won out. And as Gaelic became the principal language and culture, so the Gaelic use of surnames became widespread. They developed from 4 principal roots: from a person's occupation, as in Feuds, meaning parson; from a place of residence, as in Sutherland, from the lands of Sutherland; from a physical feature, as in Armstrong, a little reference to a strong arm. The most popular form of surname in Scotland, however, is the Gaelic use of the word Mac, meaning son of, as in MacDonald, son of Donald. The origin of the name Buchanan is from the Old Gaelic Buchanan, the land of the cannon, a place located on the southeastern shore of Loch Lomond. For a person with Scottish roots, your surname is only one clue in the search for your ancestry, for unique to Scotland is the ancient system of clans. The word clana is derived from the Gaelic and means children or family. It is used in its present-day context to mean an extended family, often, though not always, sharing a common name, united under a chief and bound together by a shared heritage. The clans practiced a sophisticated system of government which survived often independently of the rest of Scotland for nearly 5 centuries. They often banded together into great confederations. The Clan Tartan and the Lordship of the Isles were the most enduring. Indeed, so powerful did the lordship become that its power stretched along the entire western seaboard and reached inland to include much of what is now considered Highland. Few today know more about this age-old method of kinship and government than Rob MacDonald Parker of the Clandonald Centre at Armadale.
The clans in Scotland have been around since the 11th century and probably beyond that. The word clan is an old Gaelic word which means children. A closer description would perhaps be kin. The clans as we know them today are probably much later. After the lordship of the Isles collapsed in the 15th century, the families kind of broke out into their own separate branches, and groups such as the Keppochs and the Glengarrys identified themselves much more clearly under a clan chief. By and large, they lived very democratically, particularly through the period of the lordship of the Isles, where on the council meetings, MacDonald sat at the head of the table, but he was surrounded by MacLeans and MacLeods and McKinnons and other clans who equally had a part in this council. And they traded and they bartered and they arranged marriages and they passed laws and they heard complaints. And while the rest of the world would believe we were all red-haired, hairy Highlanders running out of the heather, I think there was some form of government that was quite beyond what was happening in other places. Well, the structure, of course, was the chief would be at the head, considered in the clan terms as the first amongst equals. His lieutenants, or his right hand, so to speak, would be the closest members of his family, and throughout the clan it would descend in order of your closeness to the chief. And the way this was interpreted was the job of the Shenachie, which is the Gaelic historian. And his job was to remember all of the family descendancies. And obviously the closer you could be to the chief, the better status you had within the clan. Obviously up until the Second Rebellion in 1745, the clans operated quite well under their clan chiefs. But after the Battle of Culloden, the whole system collapsed, and in 1746 the Prescription Act was passed by the government, which insisted that the families, the children of the chiefs, had to go south for education. And of course they came back anglicized as opposed to being Highland. The family still comes into it. Today I meet American clansmen, Australian clansmen, and I feel as if I've known them all my life. They're invited to my home, I'm invited to their home, and we only met each other maybe 10 minutes before, and it's just this, there's a complete relaxation and trust of a fellow clan member. I go to America once a year to speak to the Clandonald USA annual general meeting, and I'm always amazed that having made the long journey from Scotland to America, when I get there and I walk in, it's almost like I've just been next door for the last year. People say, "Hi Rob," like to see me all the time, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful relationship.
Ancelin O'Kane, son of an Ulster king, arrived in Argyll about the year 1016, and it is to him that the name of Buchanan may be traced. Gilbert, seneschal to the Earl of Lennox, was granted ownership of the small island of Clarinch in the 13th century. By the end of the century, Buchanan looked over Loch Lomond, reflecting the strength of the Buchanans. The family prospered in these splendid surroundings, and this land was to remain in the possession of Clan Buchanan until the death of John, the last Laird of Buchanan, in 1682. Are the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. These famous waters are in the very heart of the Buchanan heritage. There is some doubt about the origin of Clan Buchanan. Some say they are descended from Ancelyn, an ancient king of Ulster, and others that they are descended from the Celtic Earls of Lennox. But one thing is certain. The name Buchanan derives from this beautiful place, Buchanan, the home of the canon. Canon of the church, that is, for the Buchanan legacy is one of intellectual and spiritual prowess. For they took the high road, so I'll take the low road. This intellectual tradition did not prevent Clan Buchanan from engaging in more emotional activities, however. Sir Alexander, the eldest son of the 12th Laird, accompanied the Earl of Buck into France, and it is said that while there he killed the Duke of Clarence in the Battle of Bourges in 1421. 3 years later, Alexander himself was killed in battle at Yerny. His brother Walter became the 13th Laird on the death of their father. Walter was to marry Isabel Stewart, the beautiful daughter of the infamous Duke of Albany. Isabel's father was regent in Scotland during the minority of James I, and his aspirations were to bring about the downfall of his family on the beheading hill of Stirling. As Clan Buchanan grew in strength, so too did the other clans. It was not long before your ancestors found themselves in almost continual conflict with their neighbours. The Buchanans were neither Catholics nor Jacobites, a fact which did little to endear them to many of their fellow countrymen. This was also partly the reason your ancestors lost their magnificent lands around Loch Lomond. During their all too brief reign over their lands, Clan Buchanan were revered, envied, respected, and feared. The most important factor in the development of Scottish culture, and ultimately the clan system, was the advent of Christianity, brought to Scotland in the 6th century by St. Columba. Columba was an Irishman, a Celtic prince of the Aeneas and a most remarkable man. To atone for the blood he had shed as a warrior, he became a priest and chose to exile himself as a missionary in Scotland. He arrived in Dalriada in 563, just at a time when the Christian Scots had been crushed by the pagan Picts. Nevertheless, the hero Columba penetrated far into northern Pictland, converting the Druids to Christianity, and, it is said, quelling a monster he encountered in Loch Ness. Then he came to Iona and founded its monastery. Iona became an important ecclesiastical centre with contacts throughout Europe. The spirit of Columba can still be sensed here on the hauntingly beautiful Isle of Iona. The monastery remains a place of pilgrimage and great spiritual power. The shared Christianity of Celt and Pict created an atmosphere of mutual trust and intermarriage. Here once stood the ancient city of Scone, the very first capital of Scotland and the heart of its history and faith. For this is a place of kings. Here, after years of bitter enmity and wars, the Celts of the west and the Picts of the east were at last united under one high king. Kenneth MacAlpin, of mixed Celt and Pictish blood, was crowned king in 842. When Malcolm Canmore was crowned king of Scotland 200 years later, Scotland had become firmly established as a nation-state. Despite the rule of a single king, the clans maintained their own independence. There was much feuding and bloody warfare. Throughout the clan's history, there have been a number of feuds and battles. One infamous feud was a long-standing dispute between Clan Buchanan and the Galbraiths of Culloden. It began with a marriage that led to your ancestors claiming the Galbraiths' inheritance. It was finally settled when Clan Buchanan traced the last of the Galbraith family to Inch Galbraith in Loch Lomond. Galbraith, knowing that the Buchanans would gladly remove him as the final obstacle between them and the inheritance, avoided them by swimming from the shore to his castle rather than using his boat. To do this, he would tie his clothes above his head as he swam and only use a sheltered part of the shore. Eventually his cunning was discovered, and the Buchanans waited for him one night, and deciding it was too much trouble to land him, they simply lopped off his head as he swam. His unfortunate wife discovered her widowhood the next morning, when she chanced on his head floating close to the shore below the castle. Although Malcolm Kenmore's Scotland was a resolutely independent nation, events further south were soon to have an impact. In 1066, England was invaded by the Normans. Within 1 year, they had totally crushed all opposition. A wave of refugees swept north for the sanctuary of Malcolm Kenmore's Scotland. Among them, Edgar and Margaret, the children of the deposed King of England. When the English royal family fled to Scotland after the Norman invasion, King Malcolm fell quickly and deeply in love with the Princess Margaret. They were married soon after. It was a marriage that brought many changes to Scotland. Under Queen Margaret's influence, the Gaelic culture was slowly eroded in the lowlands. The Scots dialect of English began to replace Gaelic as the spoken language. The dress and manners of the English court became commonplace, and the Scottish church was radically altered. In time, the Normans and the Scots of the lowlands began a period of intermarriage, trade and commerce. Much land was granted to the Norman knights, who established their own family dynasties. Lord Elgin, a descendant of Robert the Bruce, whose own family was established at this time.
I think you would usually say that it was families north of the Highland line in Scotland, where a great chief, the strongest member of a family, had established himself and his descendants, all of whom consider themselves descended from the original chief. Sometimes he was undoubtedly a figure which could be pointed out historically. Other times, I believe you might almost say that it was a figment of the imagination. But still, this feeling that every member was directly descended from the original chief. In other parts of Scotland, families undoubtedly had a close network of relationships, but I think they tended to consider their new family as equally as important as the original one. And in the case of my own family of Bruce, many of the junior branches of the family have been immensely distinguished and are entirely separate, as it were, in their way of thinking, and could not be considered in the same way as Highland families.
The great Norman families of the lowlands, newly established in the 1100s, were to play a major part in the growth and development of Scotland. England became fearful of this developing strength, and in 1244 launched the first of many invasions. For almost a century, the opposing armies clashed violently on the battlefields of the border. This warfare brought Scotland to the brink of disaster. The death of the king, Alexander III, in 1286, plunged the country into chaos. All seemed lost until the emergence of a new leader, Sir William Wallace. Wallace led an ever-increasing band of independent Scots into battle against the English, and with an ad hoc army, vastly outnumbered, he achieved victory after victory. Here at Stirling Bridge, in 1297, the patriot Sir William Wallace routed the English army. King Edward was so incensed that he came to Scotland himself and for 2 whole years harried Wallace and his followers. Finally, in 1305, Wallace was betrayed, captured, and brought to the Tower of London, where he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Edward's dream of a Scotland subject to the English crown was almost a reality. All that remained for him was to place his ally, John Comyn, on the throne. But Wallace's gruesome execution was not to be in vain. One of Edward's supporters, the young Scottish knight Robert the Bruce, had been inspired by Wallace's struggle for a free Scotland. In February 1306, Bruce called John Comyn to a fateful meeting in Greyfriars Church. The two men argued, swords were drawn, Comyn was struck and left fatally wounded at the altar. Bruce was forced into the life of a fugitive, pursued across the lowlands and highlands. Despite the impossible odds, many Scots slowly rallied to his banner. Towns and then castles came under his control. Essential to his campaign was the control of Stirling Castle. The garrison there agreed to surrender to Bruce if it was not relieved by the 24th of June. The massed armies of Edward II headed north and were in place by June 23rd. Bruce drew up his army on the banks of the Bannockburn.
The Battle of Bannockburn took place on the morning of Midsummer's Day, 1314. Bruce, knowing he had the smaller forces, chose to occupy this high land, thus forcing the English army to come at him up the hill. At sunrise, the battle commenced, but the English armour soon found itself bogged down in the marshland waterlogged by the Bannockburn, and the English archers could find no place from which to attack. Sir Henry de Bohun, one of the bravest of the Norman knights, challenged Bruce to single combat. The Scots warrior king at once accepted. In the ensuing duel, he neatly avoided the Norman's lance and, swinging his battle-axe around his head in a huge arc, cleaved the Norman's skull with a single blow. The Scots cheered and charged, and before noon, King Edward was in full flight for the English border.
14 years of cross-border raiding followed until a treaty was finally signed. Scotland had won the day, and Robert the Bruce was her undisputed king. Bruce's campaign took place during the heyday of heraldry. One of Scotland's leading experts on heraldry is Alistair Campbell of Ayard, from the court of the Lord Lion.
It is a remarkable thing, but heraldry today in Scotland is more alive and part of our national life than it ever has been. It was in 1672 that the splendid series of arms recorded in Lion Office was first commenced, and in the last 30 years there have been as many grants and matriculations of arms as there were in the whole of the previous period put together. Heraldry came into Scotland, as with most of the rest of Europe, towards the middle of the 12th century. It had 3 important uses. The first, for personal identification, for people who were clad in all-enveloping armour, which might well have led to an unfortunate mistake in the heat of battle. Secondly, as a means of locating leaders in the field. And thirdly, very importantly, in the form of personal seals, as a means of authentication of important legal documents in a day and age when very few people, apart from the clergy, were capable of signing their own names. To make the system work, it required control, and here we see the arrival of the heralds. In Scotland, the chief post is held by the Lord Lion, King of Arms, whose origins go back to the royal shenachie of the ancient Celtic kings, although his title in its present form is first recorded in the 1300s. In Scotland, he is Her Majesty's Supreme Officer of Honour, to whom the monarch has delegated responsibility for all matters armorial. He is also responsible for state ceremonial, and is a judge of the realm with very considerable powers. Heraldry in Scotland is very firmly controlled, and as a result it's the purest system in existence today. At the outset, it must be stressed that there is no such thing in Scotland as a family or clan coat of arms. A grant of arms is to one person and to one person only. And once that grant's been made, the arms pass without further formality to whoever inherits as head of the family. Other members of the family may take out arms which are suitably different from those borne by its head. And in the same way, people of the same name, although they cannot trace their exact relationship, are given arms which are recognizably relative to those of the chief. And in this way, in Scotland, to the trained eye, it is always possible to recognize to which clan or family somebody belongs and their position in it. These are the arms of the chiefs of the clan Buchanan. Sir Walter Buchanan of that ilk married the only daughter of Murdoch, Duke of Albany, the regent of Scotland, who was executed by King James I in 1425, leaving the Buchanans in the female line the only surviving heirs of that unfortunate branch of the royal family. So the chiefs of Buchanan thereafter adopted the royal arms of Scotland, the lion rampant within a tressure, changing, however, its colours from red and gold to black on gold as a sign of mourning. The chief's crest is a hand holding a ducal bonnet, again in reference to that event, the ducal bonnet surrounded by a laurel wreath. There are two mottos, one above and one below the shield, both in Latin. The one above, Clarior hinc honos, referring to honour being all the more famous from this event. And below, Audaces Juvo, I favour the brave. His supporters are two falcons in their proper colours, beaked and taloned in gold.
Lenny House near Callander is now a very comfortable hotel, but it was once Lenny Castle, the home of a branch of Clan Buchanan. Unlike many Scottish houses, it had no pretensions to be a fortress. It had little need to be, for the Buchanan claim to fame lay in the fields of the spiritual and in the intellectual. The family had long boasted preachers, priests, and teachers, and none more eminent than George Buchanan, the Paris-educated tutor to the future King James VI of Scotland. It was Buchanan who laid the basis for that future monarch's immense learning. And it was also Buchanan who perpetrated a series of obscene libels about the young prince's mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. But coming from Buchanan, they were couched in the most exquisite and correct Latin. Nemo me impuni lacessit. Lenny Castle came to the Buchanans through a marriage with the heiress of Lenny, and they held Lenny Castle not by any form of written charter, but by virtue of their two-handed sword. The Buchanans of Arne Prior held a small estate on the main road between Dumbarton and Stirling. James Buchanan, renowned as the King of Kippen, was laird of this fascinating house. Stirling Castle lay near Arne Prior and was a favourite residence of James V. The king was fond of roaming about his land disguised as the Gedman of Balangirch, learning for himself firsthand how popular he was among his subjects. James V was renowned for his entertaining, and his sumptuous banquets were legendary. These banquets also required massive provisions to be gathered throughout the land. The Laird of Buchanan, too, was not averse to a night of entertainment. There is a story told that one night, while Buchanan was entertaining fellow friends and nobles, he discovered that his supplies were exhausted, and that there was nothing in the house to provide supper. As luck would have it, the king was also feasting that night and expecting supplies. The wily Buchanan was able to apprehend a royal provision cart as it passed by his house, and it was not long before Buchanan had persuaded the driver to part with his load. When the driver told Buchanan that he was afraid to report the loss of the king's provisions, Buchanan leaned closer to him and told the poor fellow to explain to his king that while James V may rule in Scotland, in Kippen it was James Buchanan who reigned. This the driver did, and James V became intrigued by the thought of a rival in his favourite court. Disguised as the Gedman, the king paid a visit to his fellow monarch. At first, he was refused admission, as Buchanan was having supper and could not be disturbed. But he would not be deterred and sent his herald in to announce to Buchanan that the Gedman of Berenguer requested an audience with the king of Kippen. Buchanan immediately realized who his visitor was and ran to the door to welcome his majesty. The two men at once became the very best of friends, and from that day onwards, Buchanan was to remain king of Kippen by royal decree. John, the last chief of Clan Buchanan, entrusted his affairs to Buchanan of Arn Prior, who abused that trust and forced John to pass the original Buchanan to the Grahams. Later Buchanan families of note included the Buchanans of Spittal and those of Auchmar. It was one of the Auchmar Buchanans who penned the first book of Scottish clans and surnames, published in 1723. This book, however, was wildly inaccurate, particularly regarding Clan Buchanan, perhaps because the author wished to elevate his own line and so claimed the dormant chiefship. Despite the setbacks encountered, the clan continued to be one of the most influential in Scotland. In the 200 years following the victory of Robert the Bruce, Scotland experienced a time of tremendous upheaval. The royal line of Scotland passed from the Bruce family to the Stuarts, a powerful dynasty often plagued by deceit, treachery, and greed. They sought to bring the clans of Scotland under their direct rule, to subdue the ancient Gaelic culture of the Highlands, a society based on equality, fair laws, and the code of hospitality, while the lowland system of government was feudal in nature. From the 14th to the 17th century, the Highlanders were continually harried by lowland armies who gradually won control. The age-old culture of the Lords of the Isles was passing into history. A time of great change across the entire continent of Europe, the 16th century Renaissance gave birth to the new Protestant faith. The charismatic preacher John Knox carried this new Christianity to the Scottish people, and within less than half a century it had become the dominant religion in Scotland. Spurred on by the ethos of this new religion, Scotland emerged as the world's leader in scientific, educational, and technological achievement. However, not all were converted to this new faith, among them the royal house of Stewart. Their staunch adherence to Roman Catholicism was to play a decisive role in their eventual downfall. In 1542, a week-old baby, Mary Stuart, became Mary, Queen of Scots. 6 years later, she was sent to France and returned at the age of 17 to take her place on the Scottish throne. Scotland was unprepared for her beauty and passionate nature. Her youthful charm won her many admirers and many enemies. In 1587, she was betrayed and beheaded at the command of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. However, Elizabeth died childless, and Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, was crowned King James I of Scotland and England in 1603, the first monarch to rule both countries. The royal house of Stuart had reached the zenith of its power. 85 years later, it would be destroyed. Under Stuart rule, Britain was convulsed by two brutal civil wars. In the Second Civil War of 1689, James II became the last of the Stuart monarchs when he lost his crown to the Hanoverian William of Orange. He fled into exile, never to see Scotland again. The Stewart dynasty was to attempt to regain the throne one last time. In 1745, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, grandson of the exiled king, took ship from France, landing in the Western Highlands with the statement, "I am come home." Many of the Highland clans came out in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and his army marched to within 150 miles of London. Realizing that no English would join him, he retreated to his Scottish headquarters at Culloden near Inverness. He was followed by an English army led by the Duke of Cumberland. The Scots were wakened at dawn on the 16th of April 1746 by the English drums and a barrage of artillery fire. In less than half an hour, all the dreams and ambitions of Bonnie Prince Charlie and his supporters had been blown away in the smoke of battle. Cumberland showed no mercy. The wounded were slaughtered where they lay, and those captured were burned alive.
With the defeat at Culloden, Charlie's year, or Blina Hjarlik, as it's called in the Gaelic, was all but over. Cumberland sent out his troops in pursuit of those who had been out with Charlie. The government soldiers set fire to their houses, drove out their cattle, and laid waste to their lands. The Buchanans never made it to this bloody field, although they had fought in every battle from Bannockburn to Flodden. But then they lost much of their power and wealth before 1746. Perhaps that was just as well for the Buchanans.
After nearly 400 years, the Stewart Dynasty had finally come to an end. For the clans, Culloden was the final crushing blow. The victorious Hanoverian government in London began to systematically dismantle the Scottish nation to ensure that Scotland could never again threaten English power. Scottish people were forbidden to wear the tartan, denied the right to carry weapons, even forbidden to play the pipes. The clan chieftains were stripped of their political status and reduced to mere landowners. In time, these landowners saw a better profit in wool and mutton and began evicting the Highlanders. The clearances had begun. The once vibrant Highlands were soon left desolate, stripped of the culture and a people who had lived there for 1,000 years. The land they'd fought over, tilled and tended, were left bleak, populated only by sheep. The Scots have always had a sense of wanderlust, a pioneering spirit. Scots have been emigrating since the 16th century, indeed before that, often as mercenaries. But during the mid-18th century and on, they were actively encouraged to emigrate to the New World, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Agents toured the country, employed by the various colonies to attract new settlers. The spirit of the Scots was spurred on by the lure of adventure and the opportunity to own land that could be passed on from generation to generation. The Buchanans have long been scattered throughout the world. An early emigrant of your clan to America was Thomas Buchanan, a merchant trader who arrived in America in 1763. He was vice president of the New York Chamber of Commerce for over 15 years. An American-born clansman, James Buchanan, achieved notoriety as an educator and inventor. During his checkered career, he lectured in medicine at Transylvania University before becoming a journalist in Kentucky. He invented and built a steam-driven wagon in 1825. Perhaps the most famous bearer of the name was James Buchanan, 15th President of the United States. He was noted for his ambition and energy, as well as his skill in argument. Serving as ambassador to both Britain and Russia, he developed a keen interest in foreign affairs. His works were edited to 12 volumes after his death in 1868. The Buchanans also played their part in the scientific field. John Buchanan was a pioneering botanist born in Scotland in 1819, but better remembered in New Zealand, where he published the standard work on the flora of that country. Another, John Buchanan, became a world-renowned oceanographer, and his theories on the physical and chemical properties of water were well in advance of their time. Francis Buchanan followed in the scientific tradition. He took his MD at Edinburgh University before taking up a post with the East India Company. Later, he became a noted botanist. Scottish people have left their mark wherever they've gone. This impact is reflected in the wide variety of Scottish place names and organisations found the world over. The Aberdeens, the Edinburghs and Glasgows of the United States, the Fraser and Mackenzie rivers of Canada, Dunedin in New Zealand, the Caledonian societies and Burns clubs, and of course the Highland Games that take place all over North America, Australia and New Zealand. For many people of Scottish descent, tracing their ancestral roots is an important way of tracing the richness of their heritage. Stewart Reid outlines some important points for the would-be genealogist.
The best advice I could give to people who are coming to Scotland to do the family tree is to find as much information as possible at home. Now, the best way to do that would be to ask their immediate family, other relatives, perhaps there's a family Bible, anything they can get. The objective would be to find a Scottish link. Now, by that I mean a birth, marriage or death that took place in Scotland. Once you'd ascertained a proper Scottish connection, that's the point to actually go to the record office or use a professional genealogist, and they would then take it back from there. Now, let's say it was an 1865 birth or something like that. There would be a copy of that birth certificate at the record office, which would take you to the next necessary step, for example, the parents' marriage, and so on and so on. It's difficult to say how far you can get back, because every case is completely different. But generally speaking, you're doing pretty well if you get back to the mid-1700s. It is possible to find living relatives in Scotland. A lot would really depend on whether they remained in Scotland and had issue. For example, let's say somebody's grandfather left Scotland. He may have had brothers and sisters who stayed in Scotland. So it is possible to see whether they had children, and so on up to the present day. So the bottom line is yes, we can trace living relatives in Scotland.
Whether you come to trace your roots or just to holiday, for the millions of people of Scottish origin worldwide, returning home to the land of your ancestors is a unique experience. Everywhere you go, and it's so easy to go everywhere, the friendliness of the people awaits you. There are no strangers, only friends you haven't met yet. Secluded villages and stunning surrounds are home to the many traditions and amenities for which Scotland is famous. Among these, it boasts the finest salmon fishing in the world. Where better to play golf than in the land in which it was invented, on the best golf courses in Europe? Whisky distilling is an ancient Scottish art, and people can visit the many distilleries all over the country. And of course, probably the most famous tradition of all, the tartan. Few in Scotland today know more about this age-old Scottish craft than Tony Murray.
The earliest documentary evidence of tartan doesn't appear until the mid-16th century, but there is absolutely no question that tartan is of much greater antiquity. It was not clan tartans as we know them today, but patterns which ranged from the very simple, that of the earliest known specimen of what some people would call tartan, a piece of cloth stuffed in a jar of Roman coins and found in the Falkirk area. It was purely a simple check of two colours, two shades of undyed wool, probably just the product which came to hand, the clippings of some ancient sheep, woven into a pleasant dice of black and white, what today we would call a shepherd's plaid. It was not known as a tartan then. Tartan did not have names. It was not really until much later that tartan acquired names. and especially those of clans. Up until the 18th century, tartan was very much the idea of the local weaver. They ranged from the very simple, muted colours, right through to the beautifully complex designs so typical of that time. These early tartans, of great subtlety of colour, became used mainly in the form of the great plaid, the fil amour. Now, this was a wonderful garment because it was woven so finely by these craftsmen, these local craftsmen, that it was almost waterproof. Following the failure of the Jacobite Rising of 1745, tartan became proscribed for a time. After the repeal of the Proscription Act in 1782, tartan passed from being just the product of the local weaver into an industrial context. With the rise of the industrialization of tartan, an ethic of applying clan names to the various patterns arose, and this reached its height around 1822 when Sir Walter Scott stage-managed the great visit of George IV to Edinburgh. And since that time, tartan has become the identifying feature of a clan. The tartan you see before you is the most commonly found Buchanan tartan. There was, however, a slightly earlier version of greater symmetry which first appeared in James Logan's book of 1831. From its humble origins on the looms of the local weaver, tartan progressed through industrialization, acquiring as it did the names of clans and families. Today, tartan is a living fabric, but it has progressed even further, for it now represents the names of great states. There are tartans for the various great states in America and in Canada. There is an Australia national tartan. It is an identifying feature of corporations worldwide and continues to develop. Long may it do so.
And when we leave the silence of the countryside, the splendour of Scotland's great cities awaits us, as we find ourselves enwrapped in the still vibrant culture of the Scot. Edinburgh military tattoo, highlight for thousands every Edinburgh festival, and a showpiece in the calendar of Scottish events. On the wide open spaces of the Esplanade, the pipes and drums of every Scottish regiment wait to carry the sounds of Scotland into the Edinburgh night. One has only to hear it to feel again that surge of pride in a Scottish heritage.